Hello, welcome to Catholic in America. I'm Father Michael Nixon, and we're so blessed to be joined today by Dr. Holly Ordway, who's the Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, the Cardinal Francis George Fellow of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. And she's also a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. And it's so great for you to be joined us today on Catholic in America.
Oh, my pleasure.
Well, you wear a lot of hats. You do a lot of different things, both as a visiting professor and also your work with Word on Fire and as an author as well. So within all that, within all the different things that you do, what do you think would be the most surprising for you as a young person, having grown up in a non-religious household, that today that you are a visiting professor at a Baptist university, or that you work for Word on Fire, a Catholic ministry, or that you've written a book about J.R.R. Tolkien? Which of those three would surprise you the most?
Well, I think being a Christian at all would have surprised me because I grew up in a completely non-Christian home, and I am indeed an adult convert to the faith. So I think the idea of working for Word on Fire or being at a Baptist university would have equally blown my mind. And I think sort of in a muddled way blown my mind, because at the time I don't think I would have really known much of a difference between what's a Baptist, what's a Catholic. They're all these crazy Christians. But Tolkien has been somebody I've been engaging with since I was a girl. And in fact, I have been thinking seriously about his literary critical work since I was a teenager. So that part, I would have thought, oh, that's cool. But the Catholic part would have just really surprised me. So he's mysterious in the ways that he works, mysterious and delightful.
Excellent. So when did you first discover Tolkien? We'll talk about when you first discovered Jesus too, because I think that's that's really important. But when did you first discover Tolkien, and what attracted you to his writing and to his work?
Well, the funny thing is, I actually can't remember when I first read The Lord of the Rings, because I read both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as a little girl. So I can only remember rereading them, but not necessarily the first encounter of it. So I encountered them pretty early on. I probably was between, like, I'm going to say 7 to 9 years old is going to be my guess. And they became kind of part of my imaginative sort of furniture. I just loved these books. Alongside the Chronicles of Narnia. Those I also encountered around that time and was just captivated. And they became just real favorites for me. And I kept reading them and rereading them, expanded into lots of other fantasy and folk tales and whatnot, as I was growing older. And then when I was a teenager, I picked up a battered copy of this anthology called the Tolkien Reader at a yard sale, 25 cents, I think it was. Best 25 cents I've ever spent, because that book had the essay on fairy stories in it. And that totally opened my mind for really two interesting reasins. And it kind of ties into your first question, because on the one hand, that was my first exposure to literary criticism. Because in my high school classes, there was all the, hunt the symbol. I'm like, oh, please kill me now. And I'm like, I love what I was reading, but this approach to it seems so dead and depressing. But here was Tolkien, who was doing this exploration of what is fantasy, how does it work, and it was exciting and it was insightful, and it made me want to read more fantasy, maybe want to read more literature rather than squelching it. So that was, I now in hindsight, 30 odd years later, can see that was my first encounter with what I think literary criticism ought to be, something that gives you greater appreciation for what you're reading and a greater depth of engagement. And so I think it's fair to say that encounter, when I was about 14 with that essay made me a literary critic. But interestingly, in the epilogue to On Fairy Stories, there's also what is effectively a proclamation of the gospel, because he talks about the resurrection as being the eucatastrophe, the happy ending of the story of the incarnation, and how this is a story that is the best of all fairy stories, and it really happened in history. And I remember that passage just strangely moved me. And I say strangely because I had really as little understanding of Christianity as it is possible to have in the 21st century. I really, 20th century, I really didn't grasp what it was about. but I was strangely moved. And that stuck with me. And that passage continued to move me. I did my PhD dissertation on fantasy, worked a lot with that essay. I was an atheist at the time. And yet, that passage still sort of spoke to me in an interesting way. And to this day, I reread that passage and I'm just still moved by it. And that, I think it's fair to say that that's the place where I first really heard the gospel, was in his essay on fairy stories, not even knowing what I was encountering.
Amazing. So what difference then, because so many people have they grew up in a Christian home or some sort of quasi-religious upbringing, and the fact that you did not for yourself, that your first exposure to the gospel in a sense was through CS Lewis, was through whether you knew it or not, through the Chronicles of Narnia and through Tolkien. Obviously, he's so Catholic throughout his mind and imagination. But then that explicit kind of proclamation of the gospel at the end of on fairy stories. So what difference does that make for you as someone who's you first heard the gospel in and through fantasy, and then through these amazing works of fantasy from Lewis and Tolkien?
Well, really, it has shaped my entire career as an evangelist, really, because it was, the through fantasy was really the first and deepest way that I engaged with these truths. And I must have been the one kid in America who didn't know that Aslan was Jesus. I really didn't. I genuinely did not understand that. And this is interesting because The Voyage of the Dawn Treader was and is my favorite of the series. I mean, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first and most, in a way, the best. It has to be. But Dawn Treader, I just love the Dawn Treader. But the scene at the end.
I knew there was a kindred spirit going on because I'm a Dawn Treader guy myself, as far as my favorite.
Excellent. But that scene at the end where Aslan becomes a lamb and they eat fish, I was baffled. I had zero idea what was going on. But I thought, wow, okay, well, that's weird. That's interesting. Did not know until, I kid you not, I was in my 20s and I finally cottoned on to it. And I went through a phase of being very angry with C.S. Lewis. How dare he be one of those Christians? I don't like Christians. And I had to kind of get over that. But I love his books. Okay. So fantasy had the first impact. But then as I did my undergraduate work in English literature, I started encountering more and more poets who were also Christians. Gerard, Manley, Hopkins became a hugely important figure for me. Catholic poet. I did not understand what I was reading, but it was wonderful. And so I had all these sort of exposures to Christian literature that were, I think, feeding my imagination in a Christian way when my intellect was saying, no, that's nonsense. But this was so important because it gave me the context eventually to want to ask the questions. Because I got to the point, I had my PhD, I was doing my first teaching, and I'm teaching English literature. And again, I'm teaching these great Christian poets, and I still love them, although I disagree with them. And finally, I got to the point of just saying, Tolkien and Lewis and John Donne and Gerard, Manley, Hopkins and T.S. Eliot and yada, 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 all these authors are Christians, and they are obviously not complete idiots, because you can't write something like The Lord of the Rings or Hopkins' sonnets and be a complete nincompoop. So what's going on here? And so it brought me to the point of saying, I want to understand what they believed so that I can understand their work better and with a sense of respect. I had no intention of becoming a Christian. I did not want to become a Christian. I had no idea that was going to happen, but I was able to enter into it genuinely wanting to know, what did they mean by God? What did they mean by Christianity? And that open-mindedness was what allowed me to encounter, when I started actually looking into this, the realization, oh my word, this is actually true. This is real. God exists. This makes sense of the world. This makes sense of all the things that I've not been able to make sense of. Why do I feel that I ought to be a good person? Where did that come from? That kind of thing. And this is actually a historical event. Christ really did live and die and was raised again. And that, I realized, well, if I'm going to be intellectually consistent, then I need to become a Christian. Oops. But I think that's something that has then developed into my own work. First in teaching cultural apologetics at HBU, and now as the fellow of faith and culture at the Word on Fire Institute, because I could have encountered and did encounter arguments about God and preaching about, Jesus when I was an unbeliever. And it was like water off a duck's back because I wasn't ready to consider it. But I was being prepared. There was that the preparation, the evangelical preparation for it that made me interested. And what has become sort of the foundation of my work made it meaningful, made concepts like good and evil and virtue meaningful, not just abstract words. So then I was ready to engage with them. And I think that's the preeminent challenge of our age, is to create meaning for these ideas. Because when I encountered, God as the source of all morality, I already had a robust sense of goodness and evil. Where did that come from? In part from my own conscience, but in a lot because my conscience had been formed by things like Frodo, self-sacrificially carrying the ring, to Mordor. Had been formed by Aslan, had been formed by this great literature. So I had a real sense that goodness was real and mattered. Where did it come from? How can I find it? So I think literature and the imagination it certainly was what brought me to the faith. And I think we can make so much good use of it to help others to do the same.
I love that. So you're a professor of apologetics, which for those that don't know, it's the fancy term for how to defend your faith, how to give a reasonable defense of the faith of what we believe as Christians. Maybe one of the most popular across denominational lines work of apologetics of the 20th century is Mere Christianity from CS Lewis. But I think maybe one of the things that's oftentimes missing in modern apologetics is what you swim in, which is the work of imagination and literature and even fantasy as a genre. So how often is that something that you're finding like that you wish more people were doing this, were engaging with the imagination and with works of fantasy in sharing the truths of the faith or bringing those into the conversation?
Well, I think it's hugely important. And I'm really pleased to say that over the last about 10 years, there's been a real growth in that. Because when I started doing this, working in imaginative and literary apologetics about 10 years ago, I was one of very few people doing that. Malcolm Guite is one of the early ones. He's an Anglican literary critic, poet. My friend and colleague Michael Ward, who's now Catholic, working with his Exposition of Narnia, with Plan of Narnia, and his work in the imagination and apologetics. But I could, count in one hand the people who are doing this. But now, 10 years on, especially after spending 8 years developing our cultural apologetics program at HBU, which is about engaging with the culture. And then I think, seeing also what Word on Fire has been doing for the last 10 years about engaging with the culture, I'm really seeing that there's more and more people, both Protestant and Catholic, who are seeing, oh, this is important. We should do this. We should engage with it. And I'm so encouraged by this because it's absolutely essential. We've got all these great philosophical arguments. We've got this, robust theology. We've got convincing ways to present the faith. And yet, are we seeing a renaissance, of faith in America and the West? No, we're not. It's not enough to have the intellectual arguments if people aren't able to access them. And I say not able because it's not just a question of people not listening, because people are really hungry for meaning. I mean, this is something I've seen with my work with students. They are starving for meaning. They are hungry. They are lost, and they know it, but they don't know how to access this. And so when the faith is presented to them as yet one more set of rules or as yet one more lifestyle option, but this one just slightly better than the others, or even just the terms we use to talk about the faith, they're simply not accessible to people. And I'll give one example that I use this in my book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. We talk about wanting to, for instance, avoid sin. Well, the word sin does not mean what we think it means to the people we're talking to. And I challenge, your audience to do this. Pay attention to when you go into the grocery store or when you go into a restaurant, and see how many times you'll see something like sinfully delicious chocolate cake, decadently indulgent, that sort of thing. And what it seems at first trivial, sinfully delicious, haha. But think about it. If we actually had a correct meaning for sin, we would say, yuck. Like, why would I want that? It would be like saying maggoty, wormy chocolate cake. We wouldn't want to eat it. It wouldn't be a selling point. The word sin has become a word that means, delicious, fun, exciting stuff that's a little bit dicey, a little bit risque. Those boring Catholics don't want you to do that. It has become effectively a positive term. So given that, and that's not something that you can just turn off at the snap of a finger. That's what the word means in our culture. And so it's become normalized to us. So of course when we talk about, cohabitation before marriage is a sin. What does that even mean to the young people who we're talking to? It means cohabitation is a fun thing to do. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to really think about our language. The concept is the same, but how do we communicate it? And we have to think about what do our words mean and what is the imaginative content carried by them? And how do we find ways to present the real content that really connects?
So for Tolkien in particular, as someone who obviously understood and really maintained the power of language, and as this this dynamic force, and had such a respect for it, created his own languages. Really, how much was, and then he was also engaging, as you bring to the fore, with modern literature and society, and not as some sort of Luddite where he didn't engage with it at all, or just sort of reject it, or just pine for the days of yore. How does that begin to set maybe a standard for us of how we can understand that culture has shifted, and that the meaning of words has shifted out from underneath our feet, and so we need to take that shift seriously, and not just to go along with it, but so that we can begin to bring the light of the gospel to in this modern context.
Well, that's such a great question. And that really gets into the heart of one of the discoveries I made in researching Tolkien's modern reading. This book took me 10 years to write, in part because I had a lot of research to do to discover what he had read, but also because partway through I realized I and most of the rest of the world have always thought of him as being primarily just a medievalist. He loved the past, and that's where he wanted to live. He's fundamentally nostalgic, and I didn't have a problem with that. I mean, I just loved him, loved his works. I'm like, okay, he's a medievalist. He loves the Middle Ages. Yay! So do I. But then I realized, this is a bit puzzling, because his work, The Lord of the Rings, speaks so powerfully to the modern imagination. I mean, it speaks directly to all of our 20th and 21st century issues and anxieties. And I thought, how could somebody who was only focused on the past, who only drew on the work of, Beowulf and the sagas, that's clearly a huge influence. But is it the only thing he was working with? And the answer is no. It turns out that he was extremely widely read in his contemporary literature. He read a lot of modern literature in a hugely diverse range, including a lot of non-Christian writers, including some very vehemently atheist writers. And one of the things that I noticed is that he has a very discerning ability to engage. He has a confident faith. He knows his faith. He's a devout Catholic. And so he's able, for instance, to read someone like E.R. Edison, a science fiction writer who is basically a pagan pantheist, and say, well, his philosophy is evil. He calls the philosophy evil, but he recognizes that he has a great power of world building and storytelling. So he's able to very confidently engage because he knows what he believes, and he can venture out into these different territories. And that's one thing I think we can observe as Catholics. But the other thing is that because he is engaging with contemporary literature. I mean, he was reading Finnegan's Wake. He was reading modernist stuff, all sorts of things. He didn't necessarily like or approve of it all. Definitely not. Although he liked a lot more of it than you might think. But he was engaged with it. And that meant that he had his finger on the pulse. He knew what were the kind of cultural issues. Another thing I discovered is that he was actually very up to date in the news. He took 3 newspapers. He was always interested in international news. He kept up to date in these things. So he knew what was going on in the world. And this becomes part of what he's reflecting on. And he's deeply grounded in medieval literature and ancient literature. So he's got his feet on, sort of solid ground, and he's also engaging with this modern literature. So I think that all these things brought together in his, deeply Catholic imagination meant that he could discern the spirit of the age, but not go with it, but rather challenge it, but do it in a way that's fresh. Because Lord of the Rings is not just a pastiche of medieval stuff. Trust me, I've read William Morris. That's pastiche. Tolkien is actually writing a novel. I mean, he didn't necessarily call it that, but it functionally is, because we've got well-rounded characters, which we do, interesting psychology, some postmodern literary techniques. He's got a real sophistication of technique that sometimes people don't notice because they just see what they expect to see. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very sophisticated novelistic techniques going on here. And consider, for instance, what he does with the ring. Because in folklore, magic rings are things that you want. You go on quest to find them and keep them and get them. It's a huge reversal. The whole point of the Lord of the Rings is the quest to throw away the magic ring. And it's the ring, it's of power. What is the one thing that the modern world is most in love with? Power, personal power, the ability to say, I will do this. He has this image, which is drawn from folklore and ancient medieval literature, the magic ring, but he transforms it into the most potent symbol possible of our modern dilemma, and has our characters striving at great personal cost to let go of it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you do when you've engaged with modern culture, but not gone with it.
And I think too, it maybe is one of the best examples of the struggle of temptation, in a sense that there's something greater than us that's calling us beyond what we're engaging with right now, which is evil. It's not just that good and evil are equal here, that there's something so much greater than that. We struggle with evil, but the good is greater than, because God doesn't show up in the last chapter of the Lord of the Rings saying it was me all along, but in a sense every page of it is soaked in this Christian biblical worldview, in a sense. And I think that's one of those things that very few artists or writers nowadays, Catholics, seem to possess that sort of, to be able to keep all this intention, which maybe is one of the great, the brilliance of Tolkien, is that he's able to without like a heavy-handed, this is actually about Jesus. He's able to paint a whole narrative, a story with characters that are flawed and aren't perfect, but in a sense that they're striving towards something because goodness, God is real.
Yeah, it matters. We know that Frodo's self-sacrifice is a good thing. That's completely clear. I mean, he's broken, and that's just one of the really profound things about the Lord of the Rings. And I think this comes from Tolkien's lived experience and his sort of spiritual maturity, because Frodo is broken on his quest. He does not get a happy ending. He goes home, he goes to the Shire, and he's not healed. He has eventually to go, to the West. He, as he says, the Shire has been saved, but not for me. It's so sad, because Tolkien has such a confidence in the ultimate reality of goodness, that the story has a happy ending ultimately, that he's able to look squarely at the fact that our healing may not be in this life. And that's a depth of vision that only comes from a real, I think, depth of personal holiness. And to consider the way too, that because he's so deeply convinced that good, is the winner in the end, it's not a dualistic world. he's able to present the insidious effect of evil in a very convincing way. Because evil is not just some, baddie. Like, okay, there's Sauron. He's obviously a bad figure, but look at the way we see the ring corrupting the will of people we admire. I mean, Boromir is an admirable figure, and he's corrupted by a desire to use the ring for good to save Minas Tirith. We see, for instance, Denethor, who could have been, a great figure, the steward leading his people. And he has gradually had his will sapped. He's been looking into the Palantir. He's been seeing the images that Sauron has been feeding him of partial truths, of seeing the armies and not, and seeing the devastation, but not seeing the context. Because, Sauron is the original master of propaganda. He's seeing these images and he despairs. And because of that despair, he is not only unwilling to act to do the right thing, but he actively seeks to destroy himself and his son. And that, Denethor is a powerful image of how somebody with great strengths and good intentions can become little by little weakened by sin, by temptation. In this case, not temptation so much to external power or glory, but to his own despair and his own pride, just fed by these images. And in a way, it's very prescient. We should be thinking about, Tolkien kind of says something about social media here. How many of us are looking into glowing orbs and despairing, right?
Absolutely. Actually, even as you were saying that was kind of just hitting home with me, that Denethor, who is again, for all intents and purposes, one of the good guys, one of someone who's trying to do the right thing and trying to fight against evil, but because he's seeing the world through this particular lens that's twisted and manipulated by the enemy, that in a sense all the good intentions that he has just leads towards destruction, self-destruction, destruction of those that he loves. Yeah, which if you want a more just kind of insightful analysis of social media before social media existed. And I think it just goes to show again, Tolkien, that his understanding of humanity was so profound, but rooted in his understanding of hope and grace. So the aspects of Tolkien's life that you touch on, and kind of like how it unfolded in a career that him becoming famous, which is always kind of interesting, where every single one of his lines quoted, and hyperbolic lines about literature, about other people, that can get quoted or maybe blown out of proportion. What aspects of his life do you think really helped him to have such a Catholic, small c, universal appreciation for literature, and that really kind of spills over into everything that he would write?
Well, I think he consistently engaged through his whole life with literature in the context of community. His mother Mabel, encouraged him to read at an early age. Read to him, taught him to read. He's basically raised by the Oratorian Fathers in Birmingham after he's been orphaned, and they're huge, very literate people. Gets a great education at King Edward's School, where he's friends with other people, and then ends up making the TCBS, this little club amongst fellow writers and would-be artists. Of course, most of them are killed in the Great War, so that's his first taste of tragedy. As an adult, obviously, his very first taste of tragedy was, losing both his parents, as a boy. So, and then he goes on and he becomes, an Oxford professor, and is, engaged, with literature in teaching it, but also in the context of community. He's with the Inklings, that decades-long fellowship of these guys reading their work to each other and chatting and talking. And he also had loads of other friendships. And this, incidentally, was something I discovered in my research. People tend to think of him as, being part of like a boys' club, because the Inklings were only men, and they tend to assume, like, therefore Tolkien was, just like that. He only had male friends. Quite the opposite. He had a number of female friends of fellow professors in the English faculty, and he actually co-founded a club called The Cave that had both women and men members of the faculty. And his correspondence, he has lots of correspondence with, women colleagues and students and readers. So he had a really wide-ranging set of friendships that we're also interested in reading and discussing. And I think this helped to bolster his just interest in and engagement with literature and with a wider culture. Because, and of course he had a family, he had 4 children. And so as he became a father, he's reading to them, he's interested in what he's going to be sharing with literature for them. So I think one of the things we can take away from Tolkien's life is that he was not just the lonely artist in his ivory tower penning his masterpiece by himself. He was in a community of friends, colleagues, family, and this is part and parcel of what made him great. It wasn't a distraction from his life, although he was always pressed for time, always pressed for time. But it was actually part of this rich context that made him able to do that work. And I find that really encouraging and motivational, that if I'm going to be doing my academic work and my writing in my own small way, I'm going to need to be in community and fellowship with other people, because we can't go it alone, and we shouldn't even try.
Yeah, and I think too, just in a sense, those relationships are so important for him, and maybe just one of those things too that in the modern context and even our desire to evangelize, to share God with others, that if it's not coming out of a place of deep friendships, and in a sense, it's never going to, we can be as persuasive as possible, but if we're not in a relationship of love, there's something missing. Maybe one of the great tragedies of this past year and a half too is that just recognizing that those interactions and conversations and loving arguments and disagreements in a good way, in a sense, now all we know how to do is just destroy one another with our arguments or lack thereof. But being able to do that. So the Inklings are a great example of that. And I want to dive into a little bit. Again, we talked briefly about CS Lewis. Just about his impact on a kind of mutual enrichment of the two of them, particularly with the Chronicles of Narnia, because I think that's such a great work, and it has been sometimes painted as something that Tolkien was kind of dismissive of in his writings or his response.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great friendship, and we owe so much to it, because Tolkien himself said that he would never have finished The Lord of the Rings if it hadn't been for Lewis's constant encouragement. That over years, that encouragement was what enabled him just to keep going, because he had many friends and connections, but he was very shy about sharing his work. And he said that for many years, Lewis was his only reader. And then from that place of constant just encouragement and support, he was able then to finish the book and to write more. So that we owe a great debt to Lewis just for helping Tolkien to finish it. And also we see the influence going the other way as well, because when C.S. Lewis wrote his first fictional work, major fictional work, Out of the Silent Planet, part of what will become the Ransom trilogy, Tolkien actually helped to get it published. He read it in manuscript and he loved it. He thought it was wonderful. And he even wrote to his publisher and said, "You should publish this book. It's so good." And, was really encouraging and supportive of that. So we see a kind of a mutual encouragement. Now, as you said, people like to say, "Oh, Tolkien hated Narnia." That has been going around for years now. And so that's one of the things I actually especially looked into. I thought to myself, this Tolkien guy, he's more complex than he seems on the surface. I wonder what he really thought about this. And it turns out that when you really dig into the sources, you find that it actually was not that big of a deal. Tolkien didn't care for the first bit of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that he heard read to him. He had some objections to Mr. Tumnus the Faun, and not unwarranted, because from the little bit that he heard, he just heard about a little girl having, a little, breakfast, tea with this faun. And from his classical knowledge, he would have known that in classical literature, fauns are, shall we say, not safe companions for female people, especially, young female people.
Right.
And he would have actually, he has a daughter, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He's only hearing the first couple chapters. And I think he just thought, what on earth are you doing? Like, this is kind of risque. I don't like this. And if you only see that bit, that's not an unreasonable reaction. Now we know that that Lewis actually develops it in a good way. Tumnus, he doesn't have those intentions, and he repents of his idea of kidnapping Lucy. It all turns out fine in the book as a whole. But we can see why Tolkien might have been a little bit put off by that. And he said later on that he didn't particularly care for the way that Lewis had put the stories together. It wasn't to his taste. Okay, that's allowed.
Yeah.
And that really is it. And this has been overblown, like a kind of game of telephone, that it goes from person to person to person. And by the time you get 3 biographers down, he hated them, he loathed them, it damaged his friendship with Lewis. No, it didn't. But in fact, there's a letter.
That's good for me to hear, by the way, because obviously I love both of them, and I think that kind of caricature of Tolkien in his attitude towards both Lewis and Chronicles of Narnia, I think is helpful for me. I'm like, okay, good. This seems it's a better story than what we maybe kind of been led to believe.
And it shows better light in both of them, because they were both mature, thoughtful Christians who were good friends. It's really kind of ridiculous that he would have broken his friendship with Lewis because he didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia. And that wasn't the case. They as time got on, they spent less time together, but they were also very busy men with families and all that. It's to be expected that as they got older, they didn't necessarily see as much of each other. Okay. But there's actually a letter that was not published in the letters, but turned up elsewhere, where Tolkien actually writes that he thought that the Chronicles of Narnia were deservedly very popular. And he had them on his shelves for his granddaughter to read when she came over. So obviously, by the end of his life, he had come to a kind of a grudging appreciation to say, hey, they're not my kind of thing, but they deserve their popularity, and I'm happy for my granddaughter to read them. I mean, that's pretty good, considering they weren't to his taste, and people can have different tastes. So there's no Narnia versus Middle-earth war. It's much more ordinary, but much more consoling, I think, to know that.
I love that. And the fact, too, that so the Space Trilogy of C.S. Lewis, that he bases the main character, Ransom, kind of loosely based. The character named Ransom is a philologist and is based on Tolkien, and that to me is such an interesting. For those who it's much less popular of a series than the Chronicles of Narnia, but to me is powerful. I was happy to hear from your insights that it seemed Perelandra was the middle book was Tolkien's favorite of the 3, at least that we know of. But to me is such an interesting take on science fiction in a sense. It's kind of its own sort of brand of science fiction. And I wonder too if Tolkien had ever desired to write in that sense of something that could have been science fiction. I often think maybe Lord of the Rings, if it was set on Mars, would be science fiction. That and would break new ground there. But it is interesting, just that relationship and that dynamic, even between fantasy and science fiction as well.
Well, it's interesting because Tolkien, as I discovered in my research for Tolkien's modern reading, he loved science fiction. He read loads of it. He found it very interesting, and he felt that fantasy and science fiction were not in competition. They were legitimate modes of exploring this material, and he thought it was good fun. And he did, in fact, try to write a science fiction story. He had this little, quote unquote, wager with C.S. Lewis, or agreement, that Lewis would write a space travel story and he would write a time travel story. And so Lewis writes the space travel story, which becomes Out of the Silent Planet, and Tolkien starts to write the time travel story. And the premise is that they wanted to see more of what they liked in science fiction, so they started to write them. But Tolkien is Tolkien, and he kind of gets tangled up in the plot threads, and then languages come in, and he never finished it. So there's an unfinished story called The Lost Road. It involves Atlantis. It's a cool idea, but he never ended up finishing it. But at least it shows us that he was interested in writing science fiction, even if he didn't quite get that into gear, unlike his other work.
Yeah, I was fascinated to hear that he enjoyed the John Carpenter books, Burroughs and H.G. Wells, and just again a lot of things that in my mind that he would not have been have been a fan of. And even if he disagrees with some of the philosophy, maybe it is fascinating to see that to see his consumption of those things. And even an author that he's like, I'm not a big fan of this particular author, but as you point out, you also read, I think Sayers, I think it was that he had read like 9 or 10 of her books, so that's pretty good if you're going to disagree with someone to actually say that I've actually consumed the work, and I've actually read it and appreciated it and been able to put it in its proper context.
Yeah, that's a particularly hilarious example of his tendency towards hyperbole, because it's Dorothy Sayers wrote a whole series of mystery novels with Lord Peter Wimsey, and there's a very famous quote where he basically just dismisses, oh, this is just terrible. I can't stand this Harriet Vane character she brings in. It's just terrible. But he comments that he had read all of the up until that point, which means that he had read, like you said, about 9 or 10 of the Lord Peter mysteries. So he doesn't care for the very last couple of them where the romance element comes in. I think he just preferred puzzle mysteries. He was a great fan of Agatha Christie, for instance. I think he just preferred the cerebral puzzle as opposed to Sayers' later shift into sort of the personal interaction between Lord Peter and Harriet Vane. But Tolkien has this playful streak, and he's writing to his son Christopher, and for all we know, this was like an in-joke. So he's totally going overboard. Oh, this is terrible. I hate it. But he does that. He just playfully overstates lots of things. And once you kind of get a sense of his personality, that he had this sort of boisterous personality, you start to understand better, okay, I need to see the context. Like there's a classic example that he did an interview where the interviewers asked him, what did he think about having Lord of the Rings compared to Dante's Divine Comedy? And he just loses it. He's like, I can't stand Dante, that small-minded little nobody. I wouldn't even want to be compared to him. The funny thing is that he evidently realized, the next day would have whatever. Yeah, I kind of went over the top, because in fact, he was a perfectly, fond of Dante. He was a member of the Oxford Dante Society. He wrote a paper on Dante that he delivered at the society. So he writes a letter to these interviewers and says, let me clarify. Actually, I have great respect for Dante. He's a supreme poet. Right. He backs off from it. And of course, the thing is that he got a little, I think, flustered by being compared to the supreme poet, because he doesn't feel that for an Englishman, especially his temperament, that's just too much. That's gushing. He can't stand gushing, so he just lets loose, and he lets loose on poor Dante. But of course, that was just hyperbole. That was just him saying, "Don't compare me to Dante. I'm not, no." And so he has to back off. But I just love that we actually have the text evidence of him writing back to them and saying, well, actually, Dante's a supreme poet. Right.
Right. So looking at this kind of the landscape of literature, particularly in fantasy literature, science fiction, who are you a fan of these days? Who are some writers that are writing today in our own modern context? I think your doctoral work went up to 1990s, so there's some stuff's been written since then, or even within that time frame. But that you feel is doing a good job of continuing, because in a sense, if you read fantasy, which I'm a big fan of fantasy as a genre, that everyone's trying to do what Tolkien did, so everyone's trying to capture that in some way, or is kind of judged against that, I should say, for better or for worse. But yeah, who are some writers or some tendencies that you're seeing within literature that are exciting for you?
Yes, this is a great question and a tough question, because the fantasy genre has been so shaped by Tolkien that it's ironically, I think, been hurt by Tolkien, because there's been so much imitating him that people kind of have yet to break out of the orbit, so to speak. But I do see there's some interesting things going on. One that I've read recently that I thought was really interesting was Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, which is a sort of magical, realistic, fantasy-ish kind of thing. And I won't say too much, because you kind of have to read it for yourself and experience it. And I think that very effective, very well written, very thought provoking, very original, and not derivative. There are no, like, honestly, I find it very difficult these days to read things with elves and dwarves and things like the little derivative flag goes up so quickly that I almost have an allergic reaction. That's very different. Another author that I think is underrated is actually a Catholic science fiction author called Tim Powers, who's been writing for decades.
Okay.
And he's done some fascinating stuff with like time travel. He has got a book, The Anubis Gates. He does a lot of sort of historical fantasy where he's imagining basically like his book, The Strength of Her Regard, is sort of looking at the life of Shelley and Byron, the romantic poets. What if we could explain a lot of what they did by the fact that they were involved with vampires? And he just kind of works with it, and it's just really fun. But interestingly, he has a couple of new ones that have come out in the last couple of years. I think it's like the Alternate Route series that's set in contemporary California and has these characters, dealing with strange things happening. And he's really working in a serious Catholicism into these stories, more so even than in his earlier books. His earlier books have, I think, a strong kind of underlying ethos of good and evil, support, respect for life. And it becomes, I think, it's more clear, I think, even in some of these later ones. And I think it's really interesting because he has these characters who are Catholic or maybe Catholic or, borderline. And he's doing it in a way that's accessible, and it doesn't take over the story, but it's definitely part of the overall ethos that this is a world that's consistent with the way we as Catholics understand the world to be. And he's writing for mainstream science fiction audience. And he has a short story collection called, it's got Purgatory in the title. Now I'm blanking on the title. But this short story collection has many stories that are very directly Catholic in kind of their engagement. And so I think Tim Powers is somebody who is kind of underrated, but is a really strong storyteller who is just sort of quietly getting on with the business of being a Catholic telling these stories.
Now, I'm waiting to see if you're actually going to dive into these waters as well, because there's several moments throughout the book, and in a sense painting the picture of it. I'm like, she obviously knows her stuff and the research and everything else, but as far as like the talent to be able to paint a narrative or something like that, I don't know if that's something that you've worked on before or you might have for us sometime in the future, coming out with your own fantasy short stories or long form or anything else.
Well, I am in fact not a fiction writer. I have tried, and I have decided that that's not my form. So in prose, my mode is nonfiction, but I am a poet. I'm a published poet, and so at some point in the future, we may be seeing some more of my poetry coming out. That's for the future. But you heard it here first. It could happen.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well, Dr. Holly Ordway, thank you so much for taking the time. And again, the book is Tolkien's Modern Reading. I highly recommend this if you're a fan of Tolkien, if you want a great introduction into just a wonderfully Catholic mind as far as the breadth and depth that we're called to engage with our own modern world and to be able to bring the light of the gospel to it. So thank you so much for your work with Word on Fire as well, and for being a good Catholic representative over at Houston Baptist University, which I think is great, and for your work with Apologetics.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Okay, God bless. And thank you all so much for joining us today on Catholic in America. Make sure you go to Word on Fire's website and pick up Dr. Holly Ordway's book, and we'll see you next time. God bless.